Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
A few weeks ago, Balnini Tirupati, an up-sarpanch in Telangana's Jaishankar Bhupalapalli district, committed suicide due to indebtedness. He had taken out a loan to undertake development works in the village and was unable to bear the burden after the state government's inordinate delay in releasing bill payments. Hi, dear listeners. I'm Jaison, and in today's episode, we'll be talking about the challenges faced by local government bodies in India. The story that I mentioned right at the start finds mention in Pranav Gupta's article on the plight of local governments, specifically the sarpanches in the local bodies. And I want to introduce you all to Pranav. So Pranav is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. Pranav, hi. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Carl. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to this. So Pranav and his co-author, Pradeep Chibbar, in fact, investigated the failures in governance at the local levels of government, right? And especially addressing the issues around the lack of autonomy exercised by sarpanches. So Pranav, if you can maybe just give us a background as to how does the local levels of governance work in India, right? So that would be a good way to sort of set the context, and maybe then we can get into the specific arguments that you make in the article.
So the focus of our research and our article is essentially rural local governments and rural local bodies. And if you look at decentralization in rural India, it is essentially represented by a three-tier or three-body system. So at the district level, you have Zilla Parishads and district councils are at the district level. Below that, you have blocks and you have block development councils headed by a block pramukh. And right at the local level, you have gram panchayats. Now, a gram panchayat may be composed of a single village, or in case of some states, multiple villages, often 3 or 4 villages, constitute a gram panchayat, which is headed by a sarpanch. The sarpanch in some states is directly elected by the citizens. In some states, citizens elect local panchayat members who then indirectly elect the sarpanch.
Interesting. So I think that was a good refresher for me personally after having studied this way back in school. So thanks for that very helpful sort of start. So can we maybe now look at what is the current state of affairs, right? Because in the article you argue in length about how the workings of the panchayat system is one of the biggest constraints in why they are not able to achieve autonomy. So what is the current state of affairs like, from the conversations you've had with people?
Now, in terms of the constraints and what sort of really shapes the state of affairs in reality is that parallel to these local government bodies, there exists a parallel bureaucratic structure. So at the district level, you will often have a district development. So there's a rural development department and panchayat department in every state has a whole bureaucratic structure that exists right till the local level alongside these local bodies. So at the district level, of course, you have the district magistrate, etc., the top officers, but they who sort of head who head the district government in some ways. But below that, for the rural development department, you would have a district development officer who's sort of the apex officer, who's the apex officer at the district level. Below that, you have a really, really key individual, which is the block development officer. Now, the block development officer essentially oversees almost all rural development schemes, so which would mean a large number of welfare programs, as well as various activities, projects, etc., related to panchayats and local development. And then below that, attached to each panchayat, you have a panchayat secretary. Now, the panchayat secretary again reports not to the sarpanch or not to the sarpanch in some ways. The panchayat secretary is reporting to the BDO, who's reporting to the district development officer, who's then reporting to the district magistrate. And this parallel bureaucratic structure, these individuals exercise considerable influence and authority over local governments. For a lot of activities, local governments need to take their approval, and that
Right.
shapes local development dynamics.
Got it. So just to kind of sort of dive a little deeper into this. So you spoke of three key challenges, right? And one is the lack of funding. So what do you think are the different sources of revenue that they currently say at the panchayat level that they generate? And where does, say, the bureaucracy that you mentioned about the state bureaucracy or district bureaucracy, where do they come in?
So, in terms of so broadly, there are sort of three broad sources of funds for panchayats. So, one are essentially grants and aid or designated amounts received both from the central government and the state government. So, these are finance commission grants. The amount that each panchayat gets is essentially decided by a pre-designated formula. So, the amount is essentially fixed. You get that money. Then the second are discretionary grants. So, often there may be projects that the government may want to approve, not everywhere, but in certain panchayats or certain areas. Now, that money would be distributed based on discretion exercised either at the state level or at the district level. That money is then distributed to certain villages or is money approved for projects. And the third are own sources of revenue or own money generated by panchayats. Now, sources of own revenue may vary state to state depending on what kind of powers have been devolved to local governments, panchayats in each state. But typically, this would include either some sort of local tax or revenue from land owned by panchayats. If panchayat owns some land or property that, if that is leased out, there's certain gains that the panchayat gets, interest funds that the panchayat earns. Those are sort of own source revenues of panchayats. But if one looks at the proportion, this constitutes barely 1/5 or 1/4 of the total revenues that panchayats get. The most of the money that panchayats utilize essentially comes from the top.
And what have been some of the, let's say, challenges that sarpanches have spoken to you about in terms of seeking funding, for instance, and why do you think this delay exists, for instance, right? I mean, if the money is essentially for development work at the panchayati level, why is there sort of this constraint to start with?
But there are kind of multiple constraints that exist. Okay, so one is, of course, the money being approved versus the money actually getting transferred to the account of a panchayat. That's one challenge, and usual bureaucratic government delays, etc., kick in, and that often leads to a lag in terms of money actually coming to the accounts. And the second is that even if the money comes into the account of a panchayat, it's not that the sarpanch can then keep issuing checks or keep carrying out work through those funds, even if money is actually there in the panchayat's account. In almost all states, for a panchayat to issue a check for any payment for a pre-approved project, issuing a payment check requires signature from both the sarpanch and the panchayat secretary. So you need bureaucratic concurrence, even if the money is in the panchayat's account. For releasing those funds, they need bureaucratic concurrence, and that bureaucratic concurrence may get delayed. Ideally, every panchayat should have one panchayat secretary, but due to high vacancies across various states, it is often the case that multiple panchayats have a single panchayat secretary, in which case the sarpanch may be interacting with the panchayat secretary only once a week or maybe even less than that in some cases. So these are ways in which there could be delays, and both having funds and having the liberty or the autonomy to use those funds the way you want to are two very, very different things.
Right. And I think you interestingly point out in the article that in some cases, the spending limits that are imposed, right, on various expenditures include maybe for very trivial things, maybe in terms of purchasing posters of national icons, refreshments for visiting dignitaries. So, I mean, it is, as you point out in the article, quite quotidian, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Like what it entails is that, yes, these are elected bodies, these are elected individuals entrusted with executive responsibilities as a sarpanch, but there are clearly mandated legal sort of constraints and bind and sort of their powers or their discretion is bounded legally, because when you because these are not limits that are imposed kind of informally. These are limits. These limits that we've mentioned are kind of coming from the panchayat laws and the official rules taken out by issued by the government. So these are not like informal norms that exist. These are legally mandated boundaries.
And is this in any way to do with the constitutional amendments that you mentioned about the 73rd and 74th? Can you just maybe take us through what came about after these amendments?
So what the 73rd, 74th Amendment essentially do, and 73rd for rural local government, 74th for urban local governments, the idea is that state governments can devolve certain, the one, existence of the formal existing and constitutional status for local governments and local bodies. Two, state governments can devolve both certain powers and ability to generate funds, or certain taxes or levies can be devolved to local governments. And third is the idea of mandated regular elections. And and post the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act, every state government essentially passed a Panchayat Act or an Urban Local Bodies and an Urban Local Bodies Act, and it's these acts that determine the powers, functions, etc. of local governments at the state level. And of course there may be certain variations in terms of these state laws. How is reservation done? How is the sarpanch elected, etc. But broadly there are a lot of similarities in terms of the way the limited devolution of power through these panchayat acts.
No, it's very interesting. Just to ask you a little bit more on, how they interface with the local bureaucracy, right? So, can you just give us a sense of what's the journey of a sarpanch like? Let's say he or she wants to seek approval for a development work. What are some of the processes, be it technical, financial, that they may need to go through?
So that's a very important question. And in our research, so primarily we did this research and interactions with sarpanches in Haryana, but additionally we've spoken to sarpanches in Uttar Pradesh. Then there are colleagues who've done work on other states, for instance in Telangana, West Bengal. But in some ways the experience is kind of common in terms of how sarpanches fare and what the process entails. So broadly the process is that in each state, now of course the limits, amounts may vary at the state level. So there are two parts to a project. So any project, for example, a local road has to be built, would require something called an administrative approval and a technical approval. Now the administrative approval is that this is a road, people want the road, it should be built. Now, whether this project should be done or not. Now that administrative approval, powers to extend that administrative approval vary across states. The limit up to which a sarpanch can approve a project. For instance, in Haryana, it's about 20, if I recall correctly, it's about 20 lakhs. So projects up to 20 lakhs can directly be approved by a sarpanch. But all that administrative approval means that something like this should be done. Now, if it's a higher value project, the sarpanch then has to make a proposal, make a plan, go to and then start the whole bureaucratic process of first approaching the BDO. The BDO takes his or her own time in reviewing the project, multiple visits by the sarpanch, then transfers it up and finally gets the approval. Now that's administrative approval, where a sarpanch often has some limited autonomy in terms of giving approval. The second part is a technical approval. Now, what does a technical approval mean? A technical approval essentially means whether this project, people want this road to be built, but is it technically feasible, or wherever the sarpanch has sort of suggested this road has to be built from point A to B, is that fine, or should it go from A to B to C, or what should it entail? Then, in terms of the estimate, is this a correct estimate? Or should there be or should the amount be higher? Should it be lower? What is the correct estimate for this project? Is the technical composition, or what has to be done? Is it technically feasible or not? Now, this is done by the engineering department. So at the local level, this would be the junior engineer. who has powers up to a certain level. Above that would be somebody like an executive engineer, etc. Now, technical approval again depends essentially, or the power to issue a technical approval essentially still rests with the department. And once the technical approval is given, then the project can be taken out. Either bids are solicited, again varies from state to state, or the sarpanch has autonomy in terms of to issue the project to any contractor. Now, the technical approval again is a process done entirely by these by government engineers or local bureaucrats. Now again, that involves the sarpanch going to these individuals on multiple occasions, approaching them, trying to convince them. So it often becomes a tedious process. And eventually, as I said, release of payments. The release of payments require certain approvals and bureaucratic concurrence of the panchayat secretary. And in between all of this, now finally you've got all your approvals, the bids have been approved, the contractor has been appointed, and the work has started. Now, if you look at the panchayat work rules and the laws, there are again clearly mandated functions in terms of how the work has to be monitored. If there is any sort of deviation in the work, in the actual work from, say, the project approved through the technical approval, again, the accountability largely falls on the sarpanch. And what happens in this concurrence is that what this process essentially makes is, what this leads to is that interacting with the bureaucrat or having interface with these bureaucrats becomes really, really important for sarpanches. And that's where the dynamic becomes slightly complicated. Various mismatches and issues in terms of, say, identity, social identity, gender identity, etc., come into play. So, for example, one of my colleagues, Bhumi Purohit, she's currently pursuing a book project on the idea of how female sarpanches interact with bureaucrats and how bureaucrats often sort of block work being done by certain sarpanches, how implicit bias of BDOs, of officers, mainly men, come into play when it comes to interacting with female sarpanches, and what are the kind of challenges that sarpanches face.
When you were mentioning about the technical, administrative, and also the financial approvals, I think the social approval, right, that you sort of mentioned about at the end is, I think, equally important here, right, where they have to be seen to be the good books of these politicians and local bureaucrats. And you sort of argue this point even in your article. But what actually caught my eye here, Pranav, was that they sometimes have limited administrative control over their own, let's say, employees, for instance, right? Tell us a little bit about that. That's just fascinating.
Yes. So in terms of employees at the local level, so what would be these individuals at the local level, the village watchman or village sweepers? Now, these individuals are in a lot of cases appointed either at the district level or block level. What that means is that the district or the block level bureaucracy essentially appoints these individuals at the local level. And what that means is that their dismissal, or they are accountable to the block or district level bureaucrats. And what that means is that the sarpanch, even if, say, a particular individual is not performing his or her duties up to the mark, and a sarpanch is really and people are agitated, which means there's pressure on the sarpanch to dismiss this individual, the sarpanch does not have the power. The sarpanch can at best essentially, in some cases, forward a complaint to the district or block level bureaucracy, who then review the situation and decide what action to be taken. And this is where, in some ways, the interpersonal dynamics, equations come into play. Now, you're a district level bureaucrat, you have a lot of things to oversee. You say, the additional deputy commissioner of the district, and the rural development department is not the only department you're overseeing. You're overseeing many, many departments, and one particular thing that you have to deal with is, say, dismissal of a village sweeper. Now, here is where interpersonal dynamics may often come into play. Now, rather than going over the entire case, there may be situations where there's a particular sarpanch who does a good job, who's regular, who's really concerned about individuals, and you perhaps have a good rapport. In those cases, you may sort of review the case less, and you may go with the sarpanch's suggestion. Alternatively, there could be a case where you particularly dislike a sarpanch, in which case you may be more, you may sort of scrutinize the case even more. So this is where, so these are ways in which interpersonal dynamics, discretion creep in.
Got it. So, Pranav, we'll just take a short break and we'll be back discussing the final sort of argument that you lay out in your case. Hello, and we are back discussing with Pranav on his piece, arguing that the challenges in local government bodies in India is quite pressing and something needs to be done about it. Pranav, we were talking about the administrative sort of challenges faced by these sarpanches in terms of seeking approvals, getting funding for development work. Can you give us a sense of on the grounds in which, let's say, they can be dismissed in office, right? And it was very interesting to know that they appear to be the only maybe elected officials who can be dismissed while they're still in office, right? So maybe a little bit on that would be great.
Yes, so absolutely. So there, so the biggest, so one of the biggest sort of levers or constraints that the bureaucracy exercises over sarpanches, over local governments, is the power to suspend or dismiss elected sarpanches from office. Now, if you read the panchayat laws in many cases, in many states, the law sort of leaves this idea very, leaves scope or leaves situations in which this power can be exercised very broad. So the idea being misconduct. Now anything and who decides misconduct, essentially it's the bureaucrat who has the power to dismiss, that can decide whether there's been misconduct, abuse of power, embezzlement. And in case of Telangana, there's one sort of another condition that's there, which is just mere refusal to carry out orders of the district collector or government for proper working of the panchayat. Now, if the district collector wants the sarpanch to do something, say approve a particular project or spend panchayat funds in a particular manner, and the sarpanch doesn't feel appropriate, that doesn't follow that, the DC has power to dismiss the sarpanch from office. And this power, as we found again, not just in Telangana, in Haryana, in multiple states, this power is often exercised at the district level and at the district level by DC. So there are many cases of there are often cases of sarpanches being dismissed from office for various kinds of reasons.
Got it.
Appealing these decisions is often a fair, costly process, both in terms of time and resources required for sarpanches. So often they don't really end up appealing these decisions and just end up following these decisions.
No, that's interesting to note, Pranav. Like, I was just thinking, like, while reading your piece, what could have been the arguments against, say, decentralization of power, right? And which is what you want to essentially address, right? And which is about the decentralization of power. So, if you can give us a sense of what have been the broad arguments against it, like at least in the Indian context, like, is it more to do with lack of accountability, or is there a lack of institutional memory? Like, what are those?
So yes, now that's a very, very important question. Now why do these laws exist the way they do? It's not that it's entirely power dynamics or just sort of some sort of aversion to devolution of power that leads to this. There's some valid reason, and which is why there's need to sort of figure out an appropriate balance or mix in terms balancing competing objectives in some ways. Now, the primary reasons that are given, one is accountability. Like, how do you ensure accountability at the local level? You have lacks of the sarpanches, so it's very difficult. So the number of actors at play are just too many. So you need to have a centralized common system of accountability. You can't, which is why you have everything mandated under law. You have bureaucrats who are entrusted with these responsibilities to closely oversee functioning, give approvals, so that any kind of accountability process is not exposed. That is, local governments have spent money, then there are allegations of embezzlement, and then there is some kind of probe that happens, and then there is action. So you create all these checks and balances, you bring it so that you reduce so that there's no, so you're already able to prevent some of these things. That's one. The other is in terms of capacity. Now, as you keep going down, sarpanches may or may not have, they may have a lot of power, they may have considerable funds to utilize every year, and power in terms of, okay, like building a road, building a proper panchayat bhavan, etc. Big institutions, these are projects would invariably take 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs, etc. So these are considerable projects. And apart from that, managing an entire village, which can go up from say 1,200, 1,300 to about 13, 14,000 individuals, is a big task. And doing all of these. Now, there's the idea of capacity building and the idea that sarpanches, or as you go down, there's a certain belief that local elected politicians have limited abilities, and it is because of limited capacities that you need to bring in the bureaucracy to sort of assist them and enable them in these processes. And the idea is that they may have sort of thoughts, or they may have ideas or positions in terms of what should be done, how should it be done, but in terms of official process, legal process, etc., they may not be equipped, and that's where the bureaucracy sort of comes in to enable them. So these are kind of two arguments that are often given in terms of to support these structures.
Got it. So just finally, Pranav, like I just wanted to know if you came across any specific cases of systems that worked, like that you think could serve as a model, and this could be anecdotal that you may want to share.
So in terms of some suggestions that we kind of that again come up again from sarpanches, the moment you talk to sarpanches, there's a strong desire for greater devolution of power and greater power entrusted with them. And one idea and some ideas that they kind of give is being just the bureaucrats being more accessible, not the panchayat secretary. The panchayat secretary is still operating at the village level, but the BDOs or officers like above them at the district level being more accessible. What being more accessible means that immediately ends up doing is that it kind of like the time taken for various approvals or for the entire process to unfold goes down. The other, I think there's a lot of ideas and talk about capacity building. So of course all states conduct some sort of training program among newly elected sarpanches, but can these programs be more rigorous, more detailed, more helpful in terms of so that sarpanches are able to manage a lot of these activities on their own? And then perhaps there needs to be some sort of like these are the policy instruments or structures. We perhaps need to try out new structures, like what really happens if more autonomy is actually given to sarpanches. Does it lead to greater embezzlement? Does it not lead to greater embezzlement? Like, these are things that can be tried out through various pilot projects, or there could be certain schemes or programs under which there could be greater sort of autonomy. Greater autonomy is granted to, and those could be used as test cases to see if there's a new normal that we can move towards.
Awesome. So great. I mean, what I'll do is I'll link the article, in our episode show notes, so listeners can check out Pranav's article. Apart from that, Pranav, can you give us some suggestions on what to read? Any resource that anybody interested in following developments in this space might want to follow?
So Bhumi Purohit's work is great on this whole idea of bureaucrats, on this whole idea of sarpanches and various kinds of problems that sarpanches face. Devesh Kapoor and Aditya Das Gupta have research and paper on BDOs and various constraints and roles that BDOs play. Apart from that, there's a whole body of work, emerging work by scholars like Rachel Brule, Esther Duflo, etc., and economists on essentially the impact of reservation and how sarpanches operate in various areas of development.
All right. Thanks for that, Pranav. And again, great chatting with you. And
Yes.
yeah, we hope to have you soon on another episode.
Thank you so much. This was great.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.